5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Hello and welcome to the Fighting Moose Podcast. I'm your host and narrator, Jason Hendrickson. This is a podcast where I retell stories, some fictional and some historical, that can be enjoyed by people of all ages. Well, as I promised, here we go with an audiobook. Today, we are going to read the first 4 chapters of The Adventures of Old Mr. Toad, written by our old friend, Thornton W. Burgess. Every once in a while, we see old Mr. Toad hopping around the back sidewalk between our house and our garage. While reading these chapters, it made me think of the frog and toad hike we did at the Nature Center back in the spring. I hope they do these hikes again, because it would be cool to do it again. What do you think, John? Want to go on a frog and toad hike again? Now, let's turn to today's story. I hope you enjoy. Let's begin.
Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
The Adventures of Old Mr. Toad. Chapter 1. Jimmy Skunk is Puzzled. Old Mother Westwind had just come down from the Purple Hills and turned to loose her children, the Merry Little Breezes, from the big bag in which she had been carrying them. They were very lively and very merry as they danced and raced across the green meadows in all directions, for it was good to be back there once more. Old Mother Westwind almost sighed as she watched them for a few minutes. She felt that she would like to join them. Always the springtime made her feel this way, young, mad, carefree, and happy. But she had work to do. She had to turn the windmill to pump water for Farmer Brown's cows, and this was only one of many mills standing idle as they waited for her. So she puffed her cheeks out and started about her business. Jimmy Skunk sat at the top of the hill that overlooks the green meadows and watched her out of sight. Then he started to amble down the lone little path to look for some beetles. He was ambling along in his lazy way, for you know he never hurries, when he heard someone puffing and blowing behind him. Of course, he turned to see who it was, and he was greatly surprised when he discovered old Mr. Toad. Yes, sir, it was old Mr. Toad, and he seemed in a great hurry. He was quite short of breath, but he was hopping along in the most determined way, as if he were in a great hurry to get somewhere. Now it is a very unusual thing for Mr. Toad to hurry, very unusual indeed. As a rule, he hops a few steps and then sits down to think it over. Jimmy had never before seen him hop more than a few steps unless he was trying to get away from danger, from Mr. Blacksnake, for instance. Of course, the first thing Jimmy thought of was Mr. Blacksnake, and he looked for him. But there was no sign of Mr. Blacksnake, nor of any other danger. Then he looked very hard at old Mr. Toad, and he saw right away that old Mr. Toad didn't seem to be frightened at all, only very determined, and as if he had something important on his mind. "Well, well," exclaimed Jimmy Skunk, "whatever has got into those long hind legs of yours to make them work so fast?" Old Mr. Toad didn't say a word, but simply tried to get past Jimmy and keep on his way. Jimmy put out one hand and turned old Mr. Toad right over on his back, where he kicked and struggled in an effort to get on his feet again, and looked very ridiculous. "Don't you know that it isn't polite not to speak when you are spoken to?" demanded Jimmy severely, though his eyes twinkled. I beg your pardon. I didn't have any breath to spare," panted old Mr. Toad. "You see, I'm in a great hurry." "Yes, I see," replied Jimmy, "but don't you know that it isn't good for the health to hurry so? Now, pray, what are you in such a hurry for? I don't see anything to run away from." "I'm not running away," retorted old Mr. Toad indignantly. "I've business to attend to at the Smiling Pool, and I'm late as it is." "Business!" exclaimed Jimmy, as if he could hardly believe his ears. "What business have you at the Smiling Pool?" "That is my own affair," retorted old Mr. Toad, "but if you really want to know, I'll tell you. I have a very important part in the spring chorus, and I'm going down there to sing. I have a very beautiful voice." That was too much for Jimmy Skunk. He just lay down and rolled over and over with laughter. The idea of anyone so homely, almost ugly looking, as Mr. Toad, thinking that he had a beautiful voice. "Ha ha ha! Ho ho ho!" roared Jimmy. When at last he stopped because he couldn't laugh any more, he discovered that old Mr. Toad was on his way again. Hop, hop, hipperty hop, 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 hipperty hop, went Mr. Toad. Jimmy watched him, and he confessed that he was puzzled. Chapter 2. Jimmy Skunk Consults His Friends. Jimmy Skunk scratched his head thoughtfully as he watched old Mr. Toad go down the Lone Little Path, hop, hop, hipperty hop, towards the Smiling Pool. He certainly was puzzled, was Jimmy Skunk. If old Mr. Toad had told him that he could fly, Jimmy would not have been more surprised, or found it harder to believe than that old Mr. Toad had a beautiful voice. The truth is, Jimmy didn't believe it. He thought that old Mr. Toad was trying to fool him. Presently, Peter Rabbit came along. He found Jimmy Skunk sitting in a brown study. He had quite forgotten to look for fat beetles, and when he forgets to do that, you may make up your mind that Jimmy Skunk is doing some hard thinking. "Hello, old striped coat. What have you got on your mind this fine morning?" cried Peter Rabbit. "Him," said Jimmy simply, pointing down the Lone Little Path. Peter looked. "Do you mean old Mr. Toad?" he asked. Jimmy nodded. "Do you see anything queer about him?" he asked in his turn. Peter stared down the Lone Little Path. "No," he replied, "except that he seems in a great hurry." "That's just it," Jimmy returned promptly. "Did you ever see him hurry unless he was frightened?" Peter confessed that he never had. "Well, he isn't frightened now, yet just look at him go," retorted Jimmy. "Says he has got a beautiful voice, and that he has to take part in the spring chorus at the Smiling Pool, and that he is late." Peter looked very hard at Jimmy to see if he was fooling or telling the truth. Then he began to laugh. "Old Mr. Toad sing! The very idea!" he cried. "He can sing about as much as I can, and that is not at all." Jimmy grinned. "I think he's crazy, if you ask me," said he, and yet he was just as earnest about it as if it were really so. "I think he must have eaten something that has gone to his head. There's Unc' Billy Possum over there. Let's ask him what he thinks." So Jimmy and Peter joined Unc' Billy, and Jimmy told the story about old Mr. Toad all over again. Unc' Billy chuckled and laughed just as they had at the idea of old Mr. Toad's saying he had a beautiful voice. But Unc' Billy has a shrewd little head on his shoulders. After a few minutes, he stopped laughing. "I done learn a right smart long time ago that I don't know all there is to know about my neighbors," said he. "We uns done think of Brer Toad as ugly looking for so long that we uns may have overlooked something. I don't reckon Brer Toad can sing, but I 'lows that perhaps he thinks he can. What do you all say to we uns going down to the Smiling Pool and finding out what he really is up to?" "The very thing!" cried Peter, kicking up his heels. You know Peter is always ready to go anywhere or do anything that will satisfy his curiosity. Jimmy Skunk thought it over for a few minutes, and then he decided that as he hadn't anything in particular to do, and as he might find some fat beetles on the way, he would go too. So off they started after old Mr. Toad, Peter Rabbit in the lead as usual, Unc' Billy Possum next, grinning as only he can grin, and in the rear, Jimmy Skunk, taking his time and keeping a sharp eye out for beetles. Chapter 3. The Hunt for Old Mr. Toad. Now, though old Mr. Toad was hurrying as fast as ever he could and was quite out of breath, he wasn't getting along very fast compared with the way Peter Rabbit or Jimmy Skunk or Unc' Billy Possum could cover the ground. You see, he cannot make long jumps like his cousin Grandfather Frog, but only little short hops. So Peter and Jimmy and Unc' Billy took their time about following him. They stopped to hunt for fat beetles for Jimmy Skunk and every little patch of sweet clover for Peter Rabbit to help himself. Once they wasted a lot of time while Unc' Billy Possum hunted for a nest of Carol the Meadowlark, on the chance that he would find some fresh eggs there. He didn't find the nest for the very good reason that Carol hadn't built one yet. Peter was secretly glad. You know he doesn't eat eggs, and he is always sorry for his feathered friends when their eggs are stolen. Halfway across the Green Meadows, they stopped to play with the Merry Little Breezes, and because it was very pleasant there, they played longer than they realized. When at last they started on again, old Mr. Toad was out of sight. You see, all the time he had kept right on going, hop, hop, hipperty-hop. "Never mind," said Peter. "We can catch up with him easy enough. He's such a slowpoke." But even a slowpoke who keeps right on doing a thing without wasting any time always gets somewhere sooner or later. Very often sooner than those who are naturally quicker, but who waste their time. So it was with old Mr. Toad. He kept right on, hop, hop, hipperty-hop, while the others were playing, and so it happened that when at last Peter and Jimmy and Unc' Billy reached the Smiling Pool, they hadn't caught another glimpse of old Mr. Toad. "Do you suppose he hid somewhere, and we passed him?" asked Peter. Unc' Billy shook his head. "I don't reckon so," said he. "We uns done been foolin' away our time, and Brer Toad done stole a march on us. I reckons we uns will find him sittin' on the bank here somewhere." So right away, the three separated to look for old Mr. Toad. All along the bank of the Smiling Pool they looked. They peeped under old leaves and sticks. They looked in every place where old Mr. Toad might have hidden, but not a trace of him did they find. "Tra-la-la-lee, o-ka-chee, happy am I as I can be," sang Mr. Redwing as he swayed to and fro among the bulrushes. "Say, Mr. Redwing, have you seen old Mr. Toad?" called Peter Rabbit. "No," replied Mr. Redwing. "Is that whom you fellows are looking for? I wondered if you had lost something. What do you want with old Mr. Toad?" Peter explained how they had followed old Mr. Toad just to see what he really was up to. "Of course we know that he hasn't any more voice than I have," declared Peter, "but we are curious to know if he really thinks he has, and why he should be in such a hurry to reach the Smiling Pool. It looks to us as if the spring has made old Mr. Toad crazy." "Oh, that's it, is it?" replied Mr. Redwing, his bright eyes twinkling. "Some people don't know as much as they might. I've been wondering where old Mr. Toad was, and I'm ever so glad to learn that he hasn't forgotten that he has a very important part in our beautiful spring chorus." Then once more, Mr. Redwing began to sing. Chapter 4. Peter Rabbit Finds Old Mr. Toad. It isn't often that Peter Rabbit is truly envious, but sometimes in the joyousness of spring he is. He envies the birds because they can pour out in beautiful song the joy that is in them. The only way he can express his feelings is by kicking his long heels, jumping about, and such foolish things. While that gives Peter a great deal of satisfaction, it doesn't add to the joy of other people as do the songs of the birds, and you know to give joy to others is to add to your own joy, so there are times when Peter wishes he could sing. He was wishing this very thing now, as he sat on the bank of the Smiling Pool, listening to the great spring chorus. "Tra-la-la-lee, o-ka-chee, there's joy in the spring for you and for me," sang Redwing the Blackbird from the bulrushes. From over in the Green Meadows rose the clear lilt of Carol the Meadowlark, and among the alders, just where the laughing brook ran into the smiling pool, a flood of happiness was pouring from the throat of little friend the song sparrow. Winsome bluebird's sweet, almost plaintive whistle seemed to fairly float in the air, so that it was hard to say just where it did come from, and in the top of the big hickory tree, Welcome Robin was singing as if his heart was bursting with joy. Even Sammy Jay was adding a beautiful bell-like note instead of his usual harsh scream. As for the smiling pool, it seemed as if the very water itself sang, for a mighty chorus of clear piping voices from unseen singers rose from all around its banks. Peter knew who these singers were, although look as he would, he could see none of them. They were Hylas, the tiny cousins of Sticky Toes the tree toad. Listening to all these joyous voices, Peter forgot for a time what had brought him to the Smiling Pool, but Jimmy Skunk and Unc' Billy Possum didn't forget. They were still hunting for old Mr. Toad. "Well, old Mr. Dreamer, have you found him yet?" asked Jimmy Skunk, stealing up behind Peter and poking him in the back. Peter came to himself with a start. "No," said he, "I was just listening and wishing that I could sing too." "Don't you ever wish you could sing, Jimmy?" "No," replied Jimmy. "I never waste time wishing I could do things it was never meant I should do." It's funny where old Mr. Toad is. He said that he was coming down here to sing, and Redwing the Blackbird seemed to be expecting him. I've looked everywhere I can think of without finding him, but I don't believe in giving up without another try. Stop your dreaming and come help us hunt. So Peter stopped his dreaming and joined in the search. Now there was one place where neither Peter nor Jimmy nor Uncle Billy had thought of looking. That was in the Smiling Pool itself. They just took it for granted that old Mr. Toad was somewhere on the bank. Presently, Peter came to a place where the bank was very low and the water was shallow for quite a little distance out in the Smiling Pool. From out of that shallow water came the piping voice of a Hyla, and Peter stopped to stare, trying to see the tiny singer. Suddenly, he jumped right up in the air with surprise. There was a familiar-looking head sticking out of the water. Peter had found old Mr. Toad.
Listen, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Fighting Moose Podcast. Please join us next time as we read another exciting story. Today's music was provided by the artist Analog by Nature, and the audio clips were provided from NASA. For more information to download and or listen to audio or materials from all our recordings, or to contact us, please visit www.thefightingmoose.com, or you can follow the links in the show notes. If you enjoy the podcast, please leave us a review wherever you get your podcast or on iTunes, and tell a friend. Thank you for your patronage, and as always, try and do a random act of kindness every day.
Mission complete, Houston. After serving the world for over 30 years, the space shuttle turned its place in history. It's come to a